Inlet protection, fantastic topic. It's one that everybody says, I'm going to put a barrier in front of this particular inlet and it'll take care of everything and I'll be in compliance. End of job, right? Unfortunately, that's one of the worst things you can do because inlet protection is not very effective. Matter of fact, it's one of the least effective methods for trying to reduce sediment off a construction site. What I'm going to be doing is harping on what you as Hawaiians have to deal with, HAR 55, Appendix C. And it says basically install measures to remove sediment. And by the way, there is not a single method in the whole United States or the world that you can remove all the sediment. Matter of fact, you'll be lucky to remove 10% of it off with an inlet protection. So be aware of that and think about what type of inlets do we have on our projects. And by the way, I'm going to be going through fairly quick in here because a 30-minute presentation is not very much time to do a 3-hour presentation sometimes. But that's okay, we'll get down here. There's two types of inlets that you always should be aware of. The ones that are on a street grade or in the area drain that's in a grade, in a median, or the only one that works when it's in a sump and causes flooding. If you have a clean street after a rainfall event, your BMP failed. It's as simple as that. So don't be so happy that you got something that says, oh, I got this wonderful blue little insert in my inlet here. If you don't have some dirt in the soil in the front of the inlet, it did not work. It's as simple as that. So a clean street, not good. But on the other hand, there's called liability problems when flooding occurs, right? And that's one that's really tough to get over with. Some of the techniques that we use range from just using rock, using fiber logs, of which those, by the way, when you look at that one, is installed incorrectly. How do you put any type of wooden stakes in a fiber log that's sitting on asphalt and drive the wooden stakes into the asphalt? It will float. And that's the biggest peril that we have with these. So be thinking this as we go through these. If you can lift up those fiber rolls with one little hand before it rains, they're not going to work. But as soon as they get saturated, they become heavy, heavy, heavy. They will work. So in order to make them work, before it gets saturated, you got to weight them down. You got to put a stake in them maybe, or around the sides like typical details are. Don't just throw them out there right after you buy them because they in turn will float. So those are things that we got to be careful of here. There are other measures that's out there. Grates that, inlets that you can put on, mats that you can put on top of inlets. You need to secure them. But here's the peril and probably the rottenest thing of all about inlet protection is that that's an illustration of a BMP that's going to fail. Because the fact, if you look at it, it's on a grade. And if you put any barrier in front of an inlet, and that inlet's on a grade, it does one very important thing. Diverts the water downstream. And that's not what we're trying to do, is it? And it's a tough one to take care of. We'll talk a lot about that. Also, this is another one people like to throw things at me. Putting blanket or material underneath a grate works real good as long as it doesn't rain. If you have a rainfall event with a lot of sediment, you got a problem coming up there, unless you have a very porous material. So be careful of these things. They have their limitations. Be aware of those limitations. You need to have something that has an overflow for your particular barriers. You need to be sure that you never, ever totally block an inlet. Worst thing you can ever do in this game called sediment erosion control. So be careful of these things when you see them. Because what's the purpose of an inlet? It's to capture water. You block it, hey, we can't capture it. But that's okay. We have a provision in here, we can remove them in flood events. Stay tuned for that one, folks. There's a big question on this thing here. So we got two types of conditions to worry about. On grade and in sump. Let's take a look at our on grade. It's the one that creates the biggest problems for us. On grade, you got to ask the question, should you put a barrier in front of all inlets? Oh yes, I have to, because it says right here on page 84, I have to put something in front of that inlet. That's my rules. Have you ever talked to the rules, people make the rules and say, hey, this may be causing more downstream flooding? Sometimes they don't think about it. Take a look at this one. The water flows from the right to the left. That's on a grade, and that's debris in the front there because of the rainfall event that occurred. You ought to always go out, by the way, and inspect these things when it's raining. Don't do it and wait until it's dry. But you go out and look at it when it's raining. But if you look at this thing, all that barrier, that's a rock barrier, is diverting runoff. Total waste of time, money, and maintenance costs that you're going to have to do. There's alternatives. You'll see them. Downstream, it floods. That's a natural game. That's what you're trying to prevent. That was part of what discussion of the keynote speakers talked about today. This is our typical, unfortunately, projects that we see for subdivisions in Colorado. Look at all the BMPs that are in place. Not. But look at the part that's happening around here, all that sediment that came off. And when you look at this thing, the water comes right across that barrier, and you get something that looks like that. Who's at fault? Is it the contractor? Is it the designer? Is it the regulatory people? Is it the salesperson? Is it the owner? Probably the answer to all of that is yes. Because everybody's involved and you've got to take care of it. Well, come on, here we go. So, my advice to everybody is, if you can avoid it, and you have to think of how you're going to avoid it, do not put barriers in front of inlets that are on a grade. You will have more flooding and more problems associated with it. So, when you think about all these things, they divert the water. Oh, somebody says, well, a little bit of corner over there got some. Yeah, you're going to see in a minute, the amount of sediment in runoff waters might be 5 to 10% of the total volume of that runoff. Most of it's water. And the water is what's going to cause the problems for us. Here's people going to hate what I'm going to say. That's an effective system. We love flooding in this business because that means I'm capturing the sediment, not diverting it away. So that system that we have, you've sort of got to say to yourself, now, where does that water go? Those in the room who are engineers or designers, ask yourself, where does the water go? Don't just put a barrier, because that's the thing that we always do. Ask, where does the water go? Contractors, tell the designers when they have a BMP that doesn't work. They need to hear from you. So, in this particular case, look where the water is, and the yellow ones are where the barrier's in front of the inlet. If you look at this, there's only 2 of them that you need to worry about. Look what happens up there. Why isn't there water up there? Excuse me, sir. Why isn't there water around there? It got diverted down to the bottom. And that's what is happening if you don't think about the barriers in front of inlets. So you got to be careful. We like water to be in a street only for the environmental part of it. And I realize, contractors, you don't like that water in the street because there's a liability question there. Kind of a magic game we got to play here, isn't it? So be careful of this. The other thing that's important is what's removing sediment is not that. It's this. It's the water that's ponded up that removes the sediment. Now, there are products out there that do some filtering. But if the filter gets full of sediment, it just becomes a barrier. And that barrier is going to divert water if it's on a grade. So be careful. Oh, by the way, this is our training in Colorado. We make sure people know how to push those over, and we send them out to Hawaii as much as we possibly can. But anyway, as we go through on here, here's one that's in your rules and regs, and it's with EPA's rules and regs. You can remove these barriers for flood conditions. Great. What is a flood condition? Well, it looks like we better come up with something here. Because EPA, nor does Hawaii rules, they don't define a flood condition. That I doubt if anybody would call a flood condition, right? No problem there. Yeah, now we're starting to talk about some flooding. Should we pull everything? The answer is no. You should not pull everything. Well, let's see. Yeah, that's definitely a flood condition underneath that bridge. And I guess if you really had a big heavy rainfall event, you could call that a flood condition too. But the thing is, nobody's defining flood. And you as a contractor, yep, it's going to rain today, let's pull them out. You're going to get nailed. EPA is going to someday come in here and it's going to nail you. But they've written the rule that says we can remove them for flood conditions. Designers, when we talk about flood conditions, do we have these be in our categories? Do we talk about these be in our categories? Who decides it? Do we talk about site conditions and by whom? These are little violations that EPA can do right now, and I don't know about Hawaii. They're going to be coming with a new general permit in about another 365 days, roughly. Look at those numbers. Those are big numbers. And that's just an administrator coming in and saying, we're going to ding you because you had all that problem. So think about that very carefully when you remove those barriers. It's just a matter of time where somebody's going to come and nag you there. If we have designers in the room, make sure you put in your SWIP some guidance for the contractor. Regulatory people, make sure you come up with this in the future. Okay, when we talk about getting rid of sediment, I always look for a dirty street. I'm tickled to death to see a dirty street because I know it removed sediment. I've been on an awful lot of projects. Oh, look how clean our site is. It just rained last night. There's no sediment in the street at all. It all went underneath those barriers. We don't like that. There's ways around that. You got to get rid of that accumulated sediment. Notice out at the bottom there. Removal, this is EPA for permitted areas, removed by the end of the same workday. Not 5 days, by the end of the first, of the same workday. If not feasible, by the next storm event. This is an example of, you think is a real good program? Well, that's where it's failed. I have to get over here. I'm in his way all the time here. Look at your BMPs. If you don't have sediment in front of it, it failed. It's as simple as that. So think about this at all times, because that's what they're trying to do, is keep the sediment from going into the Pacific Ocean. They're very, very limited in their ability to capture sediment. In many cases, many of those inlet barriers are better trash features than they are sediment control features. And that's what we like to try to see, and that's about 5%, maybe 10% of the total amount of sediment that came to that inlet by mathematical calcs. We know that that's beginning to fill. We can see that. Where's the sediment there? If you don't see the sediment, what in the world are you trying to do? And you can only get by with trying to pull the wool over an inspector's eyes for a short duration. And you have a gal that does a pretty good job inspecting in this site that you might want to work with her. Pervious barriers, they're good, but they have their limitations. I've seen a lot of these in Hawaii. And I don't have any problem with them as long as everybody in here and all the designers know the limitation of that particular product. Where's the sediment there? I see a bunch of trash. I don't see any sediment. That tells me it was not effective. But it might have been effective if I'm trying to get rid of trash. The openings are there are about 0.017 inches. Pretty small. If you go and take some tables, you know, us weird guys, we have these tables and we look at all this stuff. If you look at this thing, those are only good for capturing sands, very coarse sands, rocks, dead bodies, whatever the case may be that you want to do on there. It's going to let all the fines leave. That's not a BMP for the real fines. If you are only trying to get rid of medium sands, you got it. But is that what your designs are about? So basically, as you look at these things, you're looking for what's down there at the bottom, if you can. But most of the times that I've seen them, and this is nationwide, we've seen it. Matter of fact, we've seen it over in Malaysia. We do classes over in Malaysia too. It's trash that we're collecting, not sediment. So you got to be real careful when you do these things. So we go through on this thing and say, well, how does it apply to our area drains or sump drains and medians? Same story. If you take a look at this thing, look at the erosion of the channel. That says all the water bypassed that unit. And we have our infamous welcome to straw bales, which you don't have here, and please don't ever ask for a pallet or any straw bales. They're worthless. But at the same time, keep in mind, if you're on a grade, the water is going to be diverted. So that's one of our limitations we have with barriers and relying 100% on barriers for our slips. They don't work very good. If you have them and use a silt fence, don't use silt fence around an area drain. They will fail. And that's the thing you got to be careful with, is the BMP that you're using. Down at the bottom is what you're looking for if you want to make it around an area drain. You got to build a house around it. Otherwise, you're going to lose it all that we see in here. There are other types of BMPs out there. Here's a simple one that was done by chicken wire and gravel pad. You can see it's working. That's what we like to see. This is one that is out, the product is a good product, but it's on a grade. And if it's on a grade, the water's going to go right around it if it's working. Keep that in mind. And contractors, you're our eyes, you're our souls to tell the designers, hey, this is not working. We need something better. That's a product made out of Georgia. It's a silt saver. And the silt saver itself can really capture a lot of sediment. So there are products out there. Get away from just trying to yank things away because that's what the rules said. Trying to do better if we can. When I see something like this, I say, that is a joke. It's a joke because when it rains, it's going to go fill up that little tiny bit of spot there. If I want to make it effective, I got to have height. But if I have height, I got to have room for all the water is going to capture, because that's the only thing that's going to work. Not only, It's the predominant things that's going to work. So be careful with these inlet protections. And as long as we go along there, we're going to be okay here. Maximum effectiveness is going to be some conditions. On grade diverts water. There may be some effectiveness for small runoff events. It's the big ones that you got to be looking for on down the line here. And as long as you keep these little things in mind, you're going to be okay. The other part of it is designers, if we have any in the room, start thinking about erosion control and not sediment control for your plans, because that's the only thing that's going to work for it. And there's some alternatives for Hawaii. Inlet inserts. Inlet inserts are good. They're reusable. They cost more. So the distributors love you. But you put them in the ground, and the witch's hat is what I call this thing. Good products. There's bigger ones that have more volume. That's so-called the silt saver on that one. And do they take and capture sediment? You bet. You bet. Use them. You don't have to move any barriers when you use these type of products. So in summary here, most of your barriers are extremely ineffective for removing sediment from runoff waters. I hate to say it, I call many of what I see as a joke, because they don't really work that way. You've got to have ponding if you're really going to have anything effective. It's an expensive trash rack if you don't watch out, and will be more costly to contractors if they were not using erosion control products. I made it. Thank you very much.